I'm going to ask Dr. Majors to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Dr. Brannon.
Dr. Elbert Brooks has passed away. Dr. Elbert Brooks, who was the director of Metropolitan Nashville Public Schools from 1970 through 1980, passed away on Wednesday, January the 14th, 2015. He would have been 101 in April. It is sad to lose him, but we are grateful for his long life, so full of devotion to education and equity, so inclusive, loving, and caring. Dr. Brooks planned in advance how he wanted the end of his life to be celebrated. Memorial services will be held in both Tucson and Brookmead, and will likely be held in March or early April. It will be announced. Can we observe a moment of silence?
Thank you, Dr. Brannon. We'll have no thing under the good news, and so we'll move to governance issues with the consent agenda. Ms. Kim.
Great. A, recommended approval of supplement number 4 for Hermitage Elementary School additions and renovations, Goebel Hayes Partners Incorporated. B, recommended approval of request number 8 for district-wide maintenance, repairs, and general construction, natatorium renovations at Glencliff High School, Carrie G. Campbell Incorporated. C, recommended approval of request number 4 for purchase of furniture, Shane Elementary School additions, GBI. D, awarding of purchases and contracts. 1, Catapult Learning. 2, Coker Enterprises Corporation, DBA Cool Air Solutions Incorporated. 3, Earthwalk Communications Incorporated. 4, FM Sylvan Inc. 5, Maynard Select LLC. 6, Maynard Select LLC. 7, Procter & Graves Service Company LLC. 8, Southern Heating and Cooling Inc. 9, Southern Heating and Cooling Inc. 10, Vanderbilt University. E, Director's Evaluation 2014. And 2, approval,
Stop right there.
End.
You've heard the consent agenda.
Madam Chair, I move that we approve the consent agenda as read.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been approved in second. Item number 2, approval of the capital improvement budget 2015-2021, Capital Needs Committee. Oh, I'm sorry. It's been moved in second. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Item number 2. Ms.
Madam
Shepherd.
Chair, prior to this meeting, the Capital Needs Committee met and approved the capital needs budget for the next 6 years. So I would entertain a motion that we approve on the board floor the capital needs budget for 15-16.
Second.
All right, we've had a motion, we didn't need a first, it's been second, it needs a second from the committee, but are there any discussion, anything anyone wants to add, any comments from the meeting? All right, all in favor of the budget as presented?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Thank you. It's been passed. Going into reports, we'll start down here with Ms. Hunter. Any announcements, reports? Dr. Brannon? Ms. Spearing?
Yes. At the last Teaching and Learning Committee meeting, we discussed integrated math, and subsequently there was a headline in the Tennessean falsely expressing that our district was eliminating Algebra 1, Algebra 2, and geometry.
Yes, wow.
This was so far from the truth. Integrated math brings together the interrelationships of Algebra 1, Algebra 2, and Algebra 3 in 3 years of math for all of our high school students. In integrated math, our students solve real-world problems in a meaningful way. This is a step in the right direction. We have received almost $1 million grant for the implementation of integrated math. And the professional development will begin this spring with the support of local universities. And I feel confident that integrated math will be implemented with thoughtfulness and integrity. On Monday, I attended the Maplewood meeting Maplewood's Monday meeting, and community partners were there, and Dr. Register and I heard presentations from sophomores and juniors who had invented various products from the Academy of Business and Consumer Services. The one that was most popular with business partners was a prototype for a splitter for cell phones. The students had created slogans, marketing plans, and then they sold stock certificates to the investors, the community members who were present. Dr. Woodard is absolutely a genius at building community engagement. He probably had 20, would you say, Dr. Register, businesses represented there yesterday, and they are the highest. They made the highest gains of any high school and metro schools last year. We have a teaching and learning committee meeting tomorrow at 11:30 in the conference room, where we will discuss literacy initiative update and response to intervention. That concludes my announcements.
Ms. Shepherd?
I have one announcement and one report. Just a short announcement. I just wanted to say thank you to the Regal Theaters at Opry Mills Mall. I took our oldest granddaughter to see the movie Selma last Monday on Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Day, and everyone that went to the movies that day got in free. They didn't charge anyone to see the movie, which I thought was commendable to them. And also, I have a class report. CLASS is the acronym for Coalition of Large School Systems, and I am the class representative for this Board of Education, and it includes MNPS as well as Knox, Hamilton, and Shelby counties. And every Friday morning while the legislature is in session, we have a conference call to talk about the different issues that around particularly the large school systems. It's still very early right now in the bill filing session, but we have a few bills filed around education. Senator Harry Brooks is sponsoring a bill that would allow districts to withhold 3% authorized fee from charter schools. The fee would only apply to the first 250 students at the school for the first year, and it would also prohibit districts from charging rent to the various charter school operators. Also, CLASS will be supporting bills around increasing teacher pay so that BEP funding matches the average teacher's salary, and having BEP funding cover 12 months worth of insurance for teachers instead of the 10 months it covers now. Senator Harold Love, this has been in the paper as well, is also planning to file bills around the ASD priority schools, and TSBA is filing schools, allowing school districts to charge fees for record requests and county commission approval of any budget adjustments that need to be made after the district has had their budgets approved. The filing deadline this year will be February the 12th. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Kim? Nope. Mr. Pinkston?
Thank you. Just a few quick things. First, I'd like to start out by congratulating our friend, who's in the audience tonight, Dr. Kristen McGrainer, who's the leader of STEM Prep Academy, for being named by the National Council of La Raza as one of 15 educators from around the country in the 2015 cohort of fellows in the National Institute for Latino School Leaders. The Institute trains school administrators to advocate for national and state level policies to strengthen education for English language learners, and we're grateful for her leadership, not just locally and at the state level, but now nationally. Number two, I want to give a shout out to my friends at Whitsitt Elementary in South Nashville. They are rising to the occasion and really doing a good job stepping up their game. They had 80 kids in on Saturday this past weekend to do some intensive instruction to help catch up in some key areas, and I really want to commend the principal, Justin Uppinghouse, and his team for spending the extra time that it takes, and thank you, Dr. Register, Dr. Steele, and others for giving them the resources and the support that they need to do that. The third thing is our Budget and Capital Chair, Anna Shepard, and I talked briefly before this meeting. We are going to coordinate, if it's okay with the rest of the board, to communicate with the mayoral candidates this spring about setting up a briefing for them to hear about our 10-year capital projections and the resources that are going to be needed to sustain us from a facilities and capital improvement perspective over the next decade. So with your all's permission, we'll move forward and have that communication with them and get a time on the books sometime in the spring for us to all get together and have a conversation about what the future could look like. Finally, on Monday, February 2nd at 4 p.m., we will continue discussions at the Community Engagement Committee on new ideas around public engagement and board communication with constituents. That meeting will be at 4 p.m. At the Martin Center for Professional Development, 2400 Fairfax Avenue, Nashville, Tennessee. Again, Monday, February 2nd. Madam Chair, that happens to be Groundhog Day, so just
I hope you have a new agenda.
No coincidence there. 4 o'clock on Monday, February 2nd for community engagement. Thank you.
Mrs. Pierce? Ms. Rowe?
I just wanted to announce that we are going to be having a community meeting about the possible renovation or relocation of Hillwood High School, and that is going to take place on February 9th at Hillwood High School at 6 p.m. So I invite everyone to join us for that discussion.
That's right. Dr. Register?
Yes, we don't have a director's report tonight because of the abbreviated meeting, but I do have a couple of announcements in the form of updates about priority schools. We do have an East Nashville Advisory Committee meeting tomorrow afternoon at 5:30 at the Foster Avenue Community Center. And what's significant about this is that we will be discussing pathways. We've moved past those district support plans for schools. Now those are in an implementation phase, if you will. And we look forward to a conversation tomorrow night about and have received input from the advisory panel at the last meeting, beginning input about pathways for discussion in East Nashville. I also want to advise the board that our next major step in turnaround process for priority schools is making decisions about school leadership. At the last board meeting, we told you that our national recruitment efforts to find experienced turnaround principals had gone well. And that we would be in a position to make many of those leadership appointments this month. Naming these school leaders now is important so that they can begin their work this spring to develop their turnaround plans. And that's for those people who are returning to priority schools as well as new recruits as turnaround specialists in these schools. This early start is a very important lesson learned from past experience where school leaders are brought in very late in the school year or in the summer, oftentimes with many vacancies to fill. So we're really wanting to get a head start on this. We do plan to make a number of announcements this week about appointments, and out of respect and courtesy to the faculty and staff, we will be communicating with staff this week, faculty meetings in a number of schools. We will share this information with board members before it's made public. So we look forward to an important next step in the process of being successful with our priority schools.
Okay. We're done.
Thank you. All right, we'll move into our work session. Dr. Register.
Right. I'll ask Dr. Cutterstone and Mr. Henson to join me at the table back here. Madam Chair, members of the board, I don't think this is on. Is this on? Okay, there it goes. We are, as you know, the topic for conversation tonight, there it is. Topic for conversation tonight is a discussion of student enrollment and fiscal impact on our budget. It is early in the budget process, and there are many unknowns, other variables in our budget process this year that we really can't address and don't intend to address specifically at this meeting, but it is important at this early time to share with you where we are with our budget, an update on our budget, and student enrollment, particularly around charter school enrollment. So I'll start with Mr. Henson, turn it over to him.
Thank you, Dr. Register. As you board members are aware, as part of the budget process for this year, the mayor recommended and the Metro Council approved allocating approximately $38 million of the school district's fund balance to the 2015-16 budget. Of that $38 million, $16.1 million of that was designated as a transfer to the school district's debt service fund, leaving just under $22 million of the school district's fund balance being allocated as part of the funding for the 2015-16 operating budget. What I've asked Ms. Bobo to do is to distribute a spreadsheet which shows some history as it relates to use of fund balance and fund balance amount. And so I'll just touch a little bit on this so you can have a glance back, if you will. This shows from 1998, June 30, 1998, all the way through this previous June 30, 2014. Two line items that I would like to bring to your attention. The first is the top line item, which is the amount of the fund balance that was committed for the subsequent year budgetary appropriation. So what this means is this is the amount of that total fund balance, which is the bold number, that amount that was allocated to the next year's budget. And so you can see through time, through the years, that more often than not, there has been an allocation of the school district's fund balance to the school district's operating budget. If you look, for instance, I'll point out a few of the years. The highest allocation of fund balance occurred in 2003, if you're looking at operating budget, where $23.3 million was allocated, and then followed up the next year by an $11.2 million. You can also look back at 2008 when $19.2 million of fund balance was allocated, and then 2009, $12.4 million was allocated. More recently, of course, last year, $12 million of fund balance was allocated, and then as I just mentioned, $38 million, a little over $38 million was allocated for the current year budget. Again, a little under $22 million of that for the operating budget. That $16.1 million amount was transferred, is a transfer to the school district's debt service fund. Also included on this document would be the fund balance as a percentage of the subsequent year operating budget. This is something that there's a lot of interest around. The high water mark, I guess, as far as percentage goes, back in 2002, when the school district fund balance was 12% of the subsequent year operating budget. The next highest year was 2007 at 10.4%. And you can see that it's varied over time. There is a Metro Council policy that all departmental budgets, not departmental, but all separate funds of the Metro government would have a fund balance of a minimum of 5%. That's their policy. The state law does not necessarily require a certain fund balance. What the state law says as it relates to fund balance is that school districts cannot budget or cannot allocate any of their fund balance to the subsequent year operating budget except for that amount that exceeds 3%. And so there's not necessarily a 3% required fund balance, but it's obviously a very strong recommendation when state law says that if you're going to budget any of your fund balance, it could only be that amount that exceeds 3%. And so this provides a little historical context as it relates to the fund balance of the school district, the amount of the fund balance, the percentage of the fund balance, and then also the amount of fund balance that has been committed to the subsequent year operating budget. And so wanted to point that out, and also to point out the fact that as we have begun some of our budget discussions, we have been told that that $16.1 million transfer to our debt service fund that occurred this year will not be a part of next year's budget. And so we have been told that that would not be something that will come into play for next year. So any questions about the fund balance, I guess, before we continue the discussion? The next thing that I'll mention and talk about briefly would be the fact that as we budget each year, as a reminder, on the revenue side, the majority of the school district revenues are estimated by the Metro Finance Department. Sales tax revenue and property tax revenue both are projected and estimated by the Metro Finance Department. And they come out every year and say that we budget conservatively. And that has been the case. As you look over the past several years, you'll see that every year since 2007, except for one, actual revenue collections have exceeded the budgeted estimates. That one year being 2008, 2009, when the Great Recession occurred. So when actual revenues exceed collections, exceed the budgeted estimates, that increases the school district's fund balance. On the expenditure side, we have, as a school district, we have lived within our means. We have stayed within the budget. We have stayed within the funding amount that has been allocated by the Metro Council. Typically, we spend between 98 and 99% of our budget. Some years between 99 and 100% of our budget. And so whenever we get to the end of the fiscal year and we have stayed within our budget, that also goes to increase our fund balance. And so I say that to say, with a combination over time, with a combination of actual revenue collections exceeding budgeted amounts of revenue, that has sort of worked as a replenishment to the fund balance when the fund balance either when the fund balance has been used or when the fund balance hasn't been used. It serves as a mechanism to increase the fund balance amount. Likewise, on the expenditure side, as we have every year stayed within our budget, and we have stayed within the amount of funding that the Metro Council has allocated, that also goes to replenish the fund balance if it's been used, or as I said earlier, to increase the fund balance amount. And so, just I guess in summary, looking back over the last several years, anywhere between 100 and 102% of revenue collections as compared to budget, which goes to increase the fund balance, except for that 1 year in 2008, 2009. And then, as I said, on the expenditure side, spending between 98 and 99% of our budget, that also goes to replenish. And so we've been able to replenish that fund balance, whether if the fund balance was used as an appropriation mechanism, or we've been able to increase the fund balance amount over time each and every year. So that's just a little bit of information about how the fund balance works and how that amount changes from year to year.
So I guess I'll add to that and say that based on, and it's very early, and Chris is our finance person's hesitant to predict, but we're well on track to replenish a good bit of our fund balance that was appropriated last year, correct?
That's correct, and included every month in your board agenda packet, information to the board. You've got two items. One is the sales tax collections, which every month shows where we stand in relation to what's being projected. And if you look at that document in tonight's meeting agenda package, you'll see that we are just under $5 million ahead at this point with our sales tax collections. And then there's also another document called the Budget Accountability Report, which shows revenues and expenditures, where we stand percentage-wise. Mid-fiscal year is a good place to look at where we stand. And we are very close to, we're tracking right where we were at this point last year. And as I said, last year we collected 101.1% of what was budgeted as far as revenue goes, so we exceeded projections. And last year, we spent 98.3% of our allocation. And so we're tracking right where we were last year, where we were able to replenish and increase our fund balance amount.
Okay, Alan's going to talk a little bit about our projections, our enrollment projections as we add grades to our charter schools and as we bring charter schools online this year.
Thanks. Good to see you all this evening. This is the document that was emailed to you earlier and I think has also been passed out to you. So just to step you through it briefly, it's a fairly straightforward document, but in the left-hand column, you have the list of the 27 schools that have been approved to operate as of 2015-16. Okay. Sorry about that. So this document provides a complete look at the charter school allocations that are going to be required in the 15-16 school year budget. So on the left-hand column, you have first the list of the 27 schools that have been approved to operate as of the fall of 2015-16. If you go down that column, you'll see both single and double asterisks. The double asterisks, which appear next to schools like classical, indicate schools that are continuing to add grades in the grade configuration that they had proposed and were approved to operate. They will add another grade next year in 2015-16, and the projections in the 2015-16 column take that into account. Likewise, if you see a single asterisk, like the one next to Explore Community School, that represents a school that is beginning to open for the first time in the fall of 2015-16. The remaining schools with no asterisks are operating at full capacity at the present time. Continuing on down in the left-hand column, as you cross that total line, you get to the Achievement School District schools. These are broken out separately because of a separate way that funding flows to the Achievement School District schools. And there you can see Neely's Bend for 5th grade and Brick Church College Prep, which will be operating at full capacity 5th through 8th grade as of next year. Across the top, you see the columns first for 2014-15 enrollment. These are the official 40-day count enrollment numbers, bringing a total in the 27, or at this point 19, charter schools that are operating to 5,588 students. Skipping over one column to the right, you come to the 2015-16 projections. So this is a projection that is based both on the maximum amount that the school is entitled to operate under its contract, as well as a look from student assignment at the general matriculation patterns within the school, so that if you have clusters of cohorts moving through the school that are larger or smaller, you take into account those normal fluctuations that would occur in school enrollment. If you follow that column down to the total line, you see the number 8,335. That's the number of students projected to be enrolled in charter schools in the district as of the fall of 2015-16, the fall just ahead of us. The total cost for allocating these seats to charter schools is found in the next column. Here we're using a $9,000 per pupil number. The actual number is a function of the actual enrollment in the district and the actual expenditure revenues in the district, and is trued up during the course of the year. But the 9,000 estimate has been fairly close and offers a good ballpark figure to use as we're thinking about budget preparations. You can see that number, the 2015-16 projection, calculated against that $9,000 per pupil, producing a number for each individual school and a total number of $75,015,000. In the far right column, the last column, you see the 2015-16 enrollment max. This is a function of the proposals that have been approved and indicates the maximum enrollment that a charter school could have as of the fall of 2015-16. If there are any questions about that chart, I'll be happy to answer those.
And I will touch on, follow up what Dr. Coverstone said regarding the two schools at the bottom of the page, the Achievement School District schools. Just as a reminder, as Dr. Coverstone indicated, the funding for these schools is handled differently. Since these are a part of the Achievement School District, the funding for these schools is directly from the state to these schools. And so none of the funding flows through the district. Their funding is not a part of the operating transfer from the school district's general purpose fund to the charter school fund. It is a reduction in the school district's state BEP revenue, and it's based upon the estimated state and local revenue per pupil amount. And so that basically comes off the top of the school district's state BEP revenue when we receive that from the state. And so none of that money flows through the district's books. It's not a part of the transfer amount that you see in our budget. And so the transfer amount, the estimate that you see here, and this is obviously strictly an estimate, is around $75 million for next year. As a reminder, in the current year operating budget, that transfer is estimated to be a little over $50 million. So we're looking at about a $25 million increase as far as the transfer next year from the school district's operating budget to the charter school fund.
Be glad to answer any questions. Chris or Alan would.
Mr. Pinkston?
Thank you. So I want to just kind of retread recent history around the operating budget. So, Mr. Henson, can you just kind of remind us what the revenue splits have been in the last two budgets, FY 2013-14 and the current operating budget 14-15? And by that I mean how much recurring revenue in each budget year was brought forward by the mayor and ultimately approved by the council versus how much of it was drawn from fund balance, which is technically one-time revenue matched to recurring expenditures.
Sure. The increase, turn to my page here. The increase in the 2000, from 2014-15, from 2013-14 to 2014-15, the largest part of that increase was the $22 million in fund balance. There was, I'm trying to make sure I have my numbers correct because I didn't bring them. I think there was about a $4 million increase in local funding, which would have been the increase in the sales tax revenue and the property tax revenue, with the remainder being the projected increase in state BEP funding. But the majority of that increase that we received in our funding allocation was from the school district's fund balance. And I'll be happy to get you the previous year. I just don't have it off the top of my head.
Okay, let me, if we don't have the numbers handy, that's fine. Let me kind of ask the question with in a different way with a statement. We basically, and if my recollection is correct, as former budget chair, we had in FY 2013-14, 10 million plus or minus that, or 12 million plus or minus that in fund balance that was matched to recurring expenditures. Then when it came time to do the 14-15 year budget, we had to backfill that money, and then was recommended by the mayor and ultimately approved by the council to add to that another 10 or 12 million for a grand total of 22 million of fund balance matched to recurring expenditures, which means as we begin budget planning in earnest for fiscal 2015-16, we basically have to figure out how to replace $22 million worth of non-recurring revenue that's matched to recurring expenditures, right?
That's correct. The 2013, if you go back to the document, as of June 30, 2013, $12 million of the fund balance was committed for the subsequent year budgetary appropriation. And so, as you said, Mr. Pinkston, the next year, if we're strictly looking at the effect on the operating budget, that $12 million had to be taken into consideration, plus another $10 million of fund balance to get to the 22 million that was used of fund balance for the operating budget. That's correct.
So, just given the amount of recurring revenue that we were able to have access to the last 2 budget years, it seems kind of unlikely that there's going to be 22 million in new recurring revenue presented to us this year. Have you guys had any early conversations with the mayor's office about what their thinking is on how we fill this gap, basically?
We've had some very preliminary discussions about where we are, acknowledging the fact that we did use $22 million of fund balance this year in our operating budget, and that was when we received the indication that the $16.1 million transfer for the school district's debt service fund would not be required again for this year. And then also acknowledging there will be additional needs that the school district will have, including the operating transfer for the additional charter schools, as well as the charter schools that are existing that will be adding additional grades, plus other things. If we're looking at some other cost increases, we had a brief discussion around those, but did not receive any indication what the school district funding amount would be. And of course, as a school district, we're dependent upon another body to provide the funding for the school district. We present the district's needs, and then the mayor recommends and the council ultimately approves what that funding allocation would be. And we didn't receive any kind of indication of a particular number or range of numbers. You've been here a while. I mean, has it in recent history or since you've been here, have we had that much in one-time money matched to recurring expenditures? Is this the highest in your memory, or does anything else compare to this? Well, again, if you look at the document, if you go back to 2003, there was the $23.3 million allocation of fund balance that particular year to a much smaller operating budget, $477 million. And then it was followed up the next year by another $11.2 million allocation of fund balance. That, as well as looking at, I guess, the year 2008, when $19.2 million of fund balance was allocated to the district's $597 million budget, followed up the next year by $12.4 million. Those would, I guess, be the only two that would be in comparison to the amounts that we're talking about now.
And I think, those were, periods where fund balance had reached double-digit percentage relative to the operating budget. I'd be, if we were sitting on a 12% or 9% fund balance right now, I'd be not as concerned, but we're coming within a few $1 million of hitting what the council has told us should be the floor for the fund balance. So I guess I'd just like to know, if we can somehow manage to pull together, through the mayor's generosity and the council's approval, $22 million in new revenue, then that gets us to a 0% budget, right? So kind of what's your guys thinking about how we fund new stuff beyond filling the hole that exists?
Yeah, good question. When we look, and we've had some good conversations with Mr. Riebling, with Rich Riebling, and I've had a good conversation with the mayor. So, I think one thing that we have to say is that we have been generally supported very well by Metro Council and Mayor Dean. When you look at our $44 million fund balance listed in 2014, remember that is the beginning fund balance after we've budgeted fund balance. That's the beginning of the year, so we expect that number to go up. It's just too early to predict exactly what it's going to be. So somewhere between the 44 million and the 65 million from the previous year is where we expect to fall. So there will be we don't expect to make it up completely, not necessarily. I don't think we're in a crisis either. I think we just have to be smart with the way we budget this year. and there are a number of variables that we just don't know yet. It's too early to tell where we are with that. One really important one, and that is not happening, as I'll go back to the one where we are not having to transfer $16 million into debt service. That was an important addition last year that really hurt us.
And I'll also just touch on, I mentioned where we stand currently with our sales tax revenue collections in relation to budget. The one that's difficult to estimate at this point in the year is the property tax revenue, because technically property taxes aren't due until February the 28th, which means you don't really know where you're standing until March. And so that was something that we discussed with Mr. Riebling as far as looking at where we might end up on the revenue side. That's still the one, I guess, big unknown on the revenue side is the property tax revenue. But as I mentioned, sales tax is trending and tracking above projections, and our expenditures are tracking just below what's been budgeted, right with where we were last year.
Just one more thing, then I'll stop for now. I just kind of disagree that it's too early to have this conversation. I mean, if this were, August, 2 months into the fiscal year, that'd be one thing. But we're sitting here 60 days potentially away from being close to having a final budget to take to the mayor, and I just think we need to assume that we're not going to have the gift of $22 million in new revenue to work with, and that we further need to assume that we need to start looking for cuts. So maybe, this is a period of austerity that we may be going into, and we have to make some tough decisions, but I'll stop there for now.
Anybody else?
Just in general?
Yeah. As long as it's on this topic.
So maybe my question is more for Mr. Pinkston. Based on your email and your call for a moratorium, can we just go ahead and lay it out there, what you're proposing?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, in the last board meeting when I brought notice of the motion, I think it would be fiscally irresponsible for us to move forward with approvals of new schools of any type, charter, magnet, traditional, or others, until we have a plan in place for first closing this $22 million gap, and then further that just gets us back to a 0% budget growth, and then further, where's the additional money coming from that we would propose spending on any new school. Dr. Register sent around some follow-up information later in the day. The MGT report projects out, and I'm sure Dr. Coverstone has these numbers separately, by fall 2019, even if we did nothing else, approved no new schools, we're going to add 5,000 more charter seats under existing agreements, or an additional $45 million in annual cash outlays. I mean, that's the functional equivalent of 5 new middle schools, even if we do nothing else this cycle. So I think the key word is until we have a plan for dealing with this pretty significant hole that we've got to backfill, and then further have a plan for kind of where the additional money is going to come from, or corresponding cuts. I don't want to just say it's all new money. I think it's probably time to be introspective and look within the system and see kind of where else these resources can be found. Budget gaps are closed, as we know, through a combination of new revenue generally and corresponding cuts elsewhere. So I think until we've got a plan, I don't think it's fiscally responsible to move forward.
Well, on Thursday night, I felt like we had such a great conversation as a board on what it meant to be fiscally minded. And you actually said it best. I feel funny calling you Mr. Pinkston. You know that government has waste. And as an entity, a government entity, MNPS has waste. And what, as a board, and what we hope to in our new superintendent and current leadership, is to be a hawk for waste. So I would like to call for a moratorium on waste instead of going straight for our core mission, to say even these 5,000 new students, they're not going to, if they came to MNPS district schools, you would still be having an outlay for them. This is not a function of whether they're at a charter or traditional or magnet. If the city is growing and students are growing, you're going to have outlays. Is that, and I mean, I would like to ask Mr. Henson too, if he can tell us what is the average cost to educate a district student? I mean, because we tend to look at charters as the revenue versus cost instead of figuring out what is that differential. It's not that it's all 9,000 is saved. You know, we still have a cost to educate our kids.
And that is correct. And we are working toward that number as we finalize our student-based budgeting, which we are transitioning to this year with all schools. It is not the same amount because there are some district-wide costs that are spread out over all of the students in all of the schools, but there are obviously, and there can be a per pupil amount that's calculated, which we will have within the next couple of weeks. And one other thing I'll point out is that we're still growing as a school district. We're projected to grow almost 1,500 additional students next year at this point. That makeup is additional 3,000 charter school students, which means that the non-charter enrollment will be decreasing for the first time, around 1,500. And so we will be looking at the schools on a school-by-school basis, looking at where those reductions will take place, because that does not obviously occur evenly throughout the district, but I'm sure we'll still have some schools down in the southeastern quadrant of the county that will continue to grow. But we will also have some schools that they will have reductions in their enrollment, and so we will need to look to make reductions in costs associated with that reduction in enrollment. So this will be the first year where we'll have that dynamic, so to speak, where we have the non-charter enrollment district-wide actually decreasing. And so we're going to be looking where we can to make reductions in relation to that reduced student enrollment.
Okay.
Mr. Pinkston?
Yeah, I mean, just to respond, Ms. Pierce, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think that looking for waste and figuring out where to trim is every bit as important, if not more, than going out and identifying new revenue to support new initiatives. So that's why I'm saying let's get a plan. Unfortunately, you and I can't do that, but we have to ask others to do that. So I think it's a logical thing to put the horse before the cart. Let's get a plan for how we're going to manage through the next 2 or 3 cycles in particular, especially given the fact that we have already, like I said, approved. There's 5,000 more seats that are going to come online if we do nothing else today. And again, that's the equivalent, functional equivalent of 5 new middle schools. I'm not saying let's not continue to add those seats, but let's be smart about what we're doing and get a plan together before we go into any new approvals of any type of school.
I would agree, but I would like, in my personal opinion, I think that we should probably have the conversation before we start drawing lines in the sand, because I think that just puts our backs up against the wall. So we need to start the conversation, and it needs to be, soon and deliberate, and, searching through our budget to make sure that we are smart with it, because it's a lot of dollars and it affects a lot of children. So I think that's for our first step, in my personal opinion.
I agree, and I agree, and I agree, and to be in fairness, I've been asking quietly, going back to November, December, for a plan. I guess the question I've got right now is, we going back to December when the charter RFP first came to us, there's, a lot of kind of hurry up and approve this, or hurry up and bless this so we can get it to market. Kind of where are we functionally on the timeline for new school approvals at this point, relative to our normal process and relative to state law, and how much time do we really have to work on to get a plan and have the conversation that Ms. Shepherd's talking about?
Well, we have already had to post the instructions for filing applications with the state. Those are available at the state's website anyway, and we'll be accepting letters of intent in a week. The applications are due April 1st, and the evaluation process, of course, as you know, carries on through April, May, and into June. So that's the functional timeline I think you're asking about.
So approvals would be in June?
Yeah.
Conceivably, and people are sending letters of intent next week, what are those? Are those in response to some guidance you've put into the market, or is it something else?
Only the priorities that had previously been listed from last year are still kind of in the market, but we have not defined as crisply as I would like the priorities that you want when we make recommendations to you, so that we can order them based on need, and we can still do that.
Well, a few things stood out for me when I looked over this, the enrollment for charter schools. First of all, we have a lot of schools that are very small, just lots and lots of small enrollment numbers. And they are pretty much not at capacity. Some of them are still expanding, but even of the schools that have all their grade levels in place, they are under capacity or not fully enrolled. Most of them, STEM Prep is an exception, and we got a couple exceptions, but most of them are under capacity. And I would say that that's really not a very good, efficient use of our dollars to keep opening schools that are not at full yet. And then just a few facts that we've talked about before, and I don't have these numbers at the tip of my fingertips, so I think maybe you, Mr. Henson, or you, Mr. Pinkston, will remember this, but over the past 10 years, cash outlays for charters have been growing on average. I think it was 44% versus only 4% for the rest of the district. Is that correct?
Yeah, last 8
years.
budget cycles.
And then we have this MGT report that says if we continue to open new charter schools, that will, quote, with nearly 100% certainty have a negative fiscal impact on the district. So I think we're going to have to do something different. We had a big jump, in our how much we borrowed from the fund balance this year. I mean, we're going to have to think, I think, very differently about how we move forward. And I don't really see that there is a dire need for more schools.
So I'll respond to that, actually. So as Dr. Coverstone said, and as we agreed to at this table, there's still work for this board and on the shoulders of this board to do to continue to refine the priorities that we agreed upon. So the priorities were presented a few meetings ago. There was some angst at the table here around those guidelines still being a little too broad. And I think, and I will continue to say, that we have data that was compiled by Dr. Coverstone's office that gives us all the information we need to determine how we refine by cluster what our needs or how charter operators can help relieve something, whether it's capacity issues we're having, whether it's academic performance issues we're having in those clusters. We have the data that's already been given to us. We have had it for almost 2 months now, maybe even longer than that. We just need to have the discussion to refine that. And so, Ms. Rowe, what I would say is, even though you may see on here, and I'm not sure I'm seeing the same thing you're seeing, schools that are quote unquote under capacity, are these schools that are in areas where we need relief? And that's the discussion that we have committed to have, and we haven't had it yet. And the ask was to have this discussion around budget before we got to that discussion. Again, we have all these pieces out here that as a board we haven't completed and we haven't closed the gap on to be able to get to that next step, which is now having a lens through which we expect the Office of Innovation to review those charter applications when they begin to come in. So there's still a next step for us to refine that. And so, and just to refresh your memory, that would be for the Stratford cluster, if we believe overcapacity is anything over 100, or is it over 110, or is it 115%? We need to be a part of the discussion to help define what that is, and that percentage won't be the same for every cluster. The other thing I will say, and I've had this thought, and I've actually shared this thought with a couple of you here at the table, is around this cost concept. And I will just offer up just another way to view this. And we kind of hint at the alternative as, well, what if these were students that are coming into our district? Well, yeah, what if they were? they still have a cost to educate them. And on one side of our mouth, we're quick to say that these students are all our students. And the other side, when it starts to come out, well, who's going to pay for them? It's somebody else's students. And we have to make up our mind whether or not the students that are educated under a charter school model or a magnet school model or any other model within this district belong to us, or do they not? Do we not still have the same vision for what success looks like for them or not? And if we do, then we find a way to fund it. There is no denying, and I understand, I don't want to open the can of worms about whole child education. I don't want to open the can of worms about success for a student is more than just their ability to read, write, and pass standardized tests. We all agree on that. But for a significant portion of our population, that model works. They're what parents are choosing for their students. And so the question we have to ask is, for that child who has spent X number of years in a district school, to draw the line for just to finish this analogy, that has spent X number of years in a district school and still can't read, still can't compute, and finds themselves in a charter environment where the numbers are small, but they're small for a reason, where the teacher to student ratio is different for a reason. And that child that finds themselves there and then emerges at the end of one's academic year where they have failed to get to for the past 3 years, are we saying that that's not worth finding a way to cover the cost of that investment? Is the discussion important? I'm not saying it isn't. And I will say that I will admit to some fogginess around the entire budgeting process as well. But I don't know, to Ms. Shepherd's point, that the answer is to not provide additional charter seats for those students whose parents believe that that option is what they need to be successful. I think the answer is to provide additional charter seats in a smart way, by using the framework, identifying where the needs are, and where that model can provide relief for the district, as well as provide options for success for additional students. Mr. Pinkston.
I mean, I think there's actually two conversations going on here. The first one is kind of a more immediate, we have a $22 million hole in front of us. How are we going to fill that hole? And in order just to maintain a 0% growth budget. Then the second conversation is, should there be additional resources above and beyond that available that can be responsibly matched to recurring expenditures? Then how do we prioritize those investments? And then furthermore, assuming finite resources, we're going to have to make some tough decisions. And there's conversations going on at the state capitol right now about do they or do they not move forward with Medicaid expansion. It would be really, really nice for a lot more Tennesseans to have health insurance, but if at the end of the day somebody makes a determination that there may not be the resources available long-term to provide that, then that's not where that conversation is going to go. Furthermore, use the governor as an example. He, a couple of years ago, really, really wanted to increase teacher pay and decided the resources weren't there. So pulled back that commitment. And I think there's lots of things we would like to do if we had a blank check, but I think we've got to be a lot more discerning about not just sending a number over to the other side of government and hoping that the Metro Council funds, whatever we ask them to do. I frankly think we ought to bring them into this conversation and get their opinions. $22 million, this hole is the equivalent of 25% of the last property tax increase, the funds that were thrown off in 2012. So this is real money, regardless of how much we would like to continue to do this at an unabated rate. And I'd like to hear their opinions and their viewpoints, because I think they have them, and I think they're more interested in maybe having a conversation rather than just sitting and waiting for the ball to come their way.
And I don't disagree, and you and I have talked about this. I don't disagree that having a discussion around, I think the assumption, personally, when I budget, the assumption is always there won't be more money next year. And so how do I do what I know I need to get accomplished, whether my property taxes go up, or I know the gas is going to go up, or the cost of a loaf of bread goes up? How do I still do the things that I need to do fundamentally, assuming a zero increase? And I think that's the question that's really being asked is, if we get no new money, nothing happens. We don't get an increase, and we have the exact amount of money to operate on this year that we had last year. How do we accomplish everything that needs to be accomplished, knowing the additional seats that have to be opened, knowing the additional number of students that are coming into the district, knowing what we've put out as a plan for our priority schools? How do we get all that accomplished, assuming a zero increase? And I think that's ultimately what we're talking about. And I don't think that that's an unfair question. I know it makes me uneasy when we budget on a lot of assumptions, and I know that's what budgeting is a lot of times, that there's going to be more, and we'll be able to do more. And so the fact that there's more to get done should not make us uncomfortable. And I think that's where those of us have angst, but it's a fundamental budgeting concern. And so I want to make sure we keep the conversation elevated at a level that it's about how we budget. How we budget, understanding what we need to get accomplished as we go forward from year to year to year. Ms. Frobe?
I just want to respond with a few things. First of all, we talk about needing more seats and offering choice. There's no argument that there is plenty of choice. I mean, we say 5,000 extra seats are coming on board. These are open to any child in the district. We've got, if you look at these schools, there are like 150 under capacity for this year, 70 under capacity.
This year, that's a projection.
Right, that's a projection for this year, but their maximum enrollment is 100 more for some of these.
15, 16.
Right, 15, 16, their projection is 100 less than their maximum enrollment for that year. So for these are the ones that are already open. Have all the grade levels operating. So we have lots of seats, and they're open to everybody in the district. And then the second point I want to make is, if we're talking about, I guess my main argument is, let's assume that the charter schools are all just much better schools, which, I think there are a lot of questions around that because they are choice, because they have selectivity advantages. There's research that says that children of parents who make the choice tend to perform better in school. Our choice schools in general perform better. There's all these questions around that. But assuming that they're just all better because they are charter schools, if we end up funding the charter schools at the expense of the other schools, we are helping 8% of students, or whatever that is next year, at the expense of all the rest of the kids in the district. And that's the problem. I think that if we are not making sure that every school has the resources they need to succeed, then we are hurting the vast majority of our population, and that's the concern that I have. And this is not play money. I mean, that we have fiscal limits, and we have to make sure that every school has the resources that they need to succeed, especially the schools with the most challenging populations.
And I agree, and that's what I'm saying. Let's elevate this to a discussion that's about funding all of our schools, or educating all of our students at the level that they need to be. Anything?
What's the next step?
Yeah, so what is the next step? And so I think that's my question. The question I would like answered is, assuming no new dollars, where do we go in the budget as it exists to find the funds that we need to accommodate everything we know is coming our way next year?
Well, I'm going to hand this to Chris as soon as I make a comment here, but
are you going to have to run from Chris after you make that comment?
You're a fiscally dependent board, and I think your primary responsibility is to do what you're saying. Let's talk about what our needs are. Let's talk about what it takes to provide quality schools, quality classrooms in all of our schools so that our children can be successful. And that's the next step to me. Now, what we're doing as an administration is going through every budget, every program, looking at places where we can save. We have to save. We have to tighten our belts in a number of ways. We are over race to the top funding. We no longer have race to the top funding. Our federal budgets are significantly less now than they were 3 or 4 years ago. So we have to look at cuts that we can make to offset those losses in federal money as we go forward. But I think where we are is looking at baseline, what do we propose that we think's needed as we go forward, and in consultation with our county finance director and our mayor and our Metro Council Budget and Finance Committee, come to a decision later in the spring about what it actually takes, and then see what they have to offer. Then if they don't fund what we request, then there is a time when we have to come back and make deeper cuts. Chris, you have any comments?
I'll just add that the process that we're going through presently is one that we go through every year, which is a needs assessment of what do we need as a school district to meet the goals and objectives set out in our strategic plan, Education 2018. And that is where we are currently, looking at what's required, what do we need to do, what do we need to add, what do we need to take away. If you look at back to the document that I provided, and you look each year at the operating budget, you'll see typically there has been an increase every year. There are some anomalies to that, but we've been very well supported by the mayor and the council as far as education. We're in a strong economy. Nashville has a strong economy, and so we have not set out to look at a budget as if we had the same level of funding, flat funding, as this year. That's something that we could do, but that's not something that we have done as of yet. As I said, what we're trying to do is to look at what's needed in the school district to meet the goals and objectives of the strategic plan. So, and again, it's still early in what we're doing as far as looking at our needs. We will spend the rest of this month and then all of next month continuing that process and presenting a proposal to the finance committee, to the board's finance committee in early March. But we have not set that as a parameter that we're looking at a no increase budget.
So just one specific example, with this year with a reduction of approximately 1,500 students in non-charter enrollment, that amounts to somewhere between $4 and $8 million in reductions in the budget, and we're in the process of planning that now and anticipating how to do that, and a number of other places where we tighten our belts, but also looking at what programs and services we need to support as we go forward.
Madam Chair, Madam Budget Chair, is it fair at this point just to ask for a plan by the end of February for how we're going to first address this $22 million gap? And part of it could come from funds that Dr. Register just mentioned that are no longer needed because of the reduction in non-charter enrollment. But if we could somehow get to a place where we can look on paper at a plan for how we're going to close that hole, that I think feels like a good starting point. But tell me if that's not a fair request.
I would defer to Mr. Henson. Is that too preliminary? Too early in the game, or?
If the board wanted the administration to take that route, then that would change, that would alter what we're going to be doing over the next 5 weeks or so. If we're looking, again, if there are going to be some parameters set as far as what's going to be proposed as far as needs go for the school district, then it would be helpful to know that sooner rather than later, because we're right in the middle of the process of putting together the needs of the district, and that could change what's being proposed.
So then what would be, my goal is to have numbers that are reliable instead of having to go back and reinvent the wheel with another, assessment. So what would be a realistic date that we might be able to do that plan that Mr. Pinkston is speaking of?
The timeline that he's given is exactly the timeline that we historically would be using to make a presentation and a proposal to the board. And so, if there are going to be parameters set as far as what kind of funding request or funding level that the district and the school board are going to request, that would be something we would need to know very quickly as we put together that proposal.
I'm not sure that we have any parameters. We just want
I think we're just kind of at a awkward moment in recent fiscal history because we've just got a very large number that we have to figure out what to do with in terms of backfilling before we can even have a real meaningful conversation about what do you ask for on top, of that. I just don't see how we have a real honest budget conversation without first confronting the shortfall and mapping out a plan, again, combination of new revenue or corresponding cuts to get there.
I have a question. Is it
what actually works and less of what doesn't? So if charter schools are working, if they're making the grades, is it possible to make that type of a budget assumption that we can budget for what is working and what isn't versus what isn't working?
Let's just assume that all of them are working. We've still got to figure out what to do about that $22 million hole. And either, again...
So that's not the question that we're trying to get answered.
It is about I think what's being asked is, we know even if looking at the strategic plan, there's $10 million additional in things we want to do for the 2015-2016 school year, and that will be reflected, and so the budget will go from 793 to 803. The question is, really, it's not a $10 million, it's a $32 million. And so where do we find $32 million? If there's a $10 million ask, do we assume we're going to ask for $22 million? Are we assuming that we're going to do something else to close that hole to then ask for an additional $10 million?
We can do that. Again, as Dr. Register indicated, we have not been given any indication what our funding recommendation might be. And since that's not something that we have responsibility for, many times it's a shot in the dark as far as what the funding level might be without that guidance. And so what we've attempted to do over time is to present the school district's needs, and then once the funding level is made known, then we correspondingly make changes to the budget proposal.
So a couple thoughts. One is just to affirm what you said earlier in terms of the way we should be thinking, I think, about the central issue and the question. I think that's the right framing. And it seems to me, just to double-click on your sentiment, Thais, and then sort of what you hinted at, I think, earlier, is just like, I know I say this all the time, but it really does feel like, like the budget is meant, right, for us to create, it's like resources to create impact for our kids. And so in any sort of budget review process, it seems to me that as we think about potential cuts in the eventuality that somehow we don't get the additional funding that we want, that the decision-making needs to be deeply rooted in, yes, this question of, is it producing results for kids? And if we can't draw that line, and I even have a stomach for not having straight lines. I mean, sometimes you can't say like, okay, this X amount that I invested led to Y result. I mean, I get that. But I think but even assuming a little wiggle there, it seems like we have to hold ourselves accountable no matter what, even separate from like budget shortfall questions, because this is still money that people are giving us.
And I think Thais is right, that if we aren't seeing a direct correlation between a certain investment and the result that we want, given that we have far too many kids still not achieving at the level that they're capable of, then that should, I think, cause us to ask really hard questions. And then to your point, I think we need to then figure out how we cut in the ways that we need to cut and then add elsewhere. And I'm still, I think, a little fuzzy about how that exercise would occur. But I mean, I would love to be able to see, very straightforwardly, like, what do we think, are the most important things that are, delivering results for our kids, maybe in that order, starting from the bright spots. Just like, we think these things are our best investment, this is what's working, down all the way to the can't draw any kind of connection. And I do think even like a teacher, and I tried it. I gave like just the quick line item budget, and it says, so would you all teach in schools right now, in all different kinds of schools, and if teachers can't even point themselves to like, I get why we would invest in that, or like, why do we have that team? I don't know. I didn't know they exist. I certainly don't feel their impact in my school. And you hear that too much, then it does make me question, then why are we investing in that? And so I think I would love to be able to, yes, because we just keep going, otherwise we'll just keep going round and round and round, and people have slightly different positionings about what the problem is, but ultimately, I think the big issue is how we're going to spend our money to get the best outcomes for our kids. So that's one thought. I had a second one about the audit, because presumably we have a head start on these questions, but I actually don't know where we stand with that. Is there an update?
On the performance audit?
Yeah.
My understanding from Mark Swan, the Metro Internal Auditor, is that that audit would be made public. The last correspondence I received from him was February 9th. And obviously we've been working with a draft of that audit and putting together management responses in relation to their observations and recommendations, but we've had it for a while now, and so we've been obviously attempting to incorporate many of the pieces of the performance audit into our operation, and then also moving forward into our budget. And so that's something that has been taken into consideration through our process.
Got it.
So will we see that February 9th?
I'll have to defer to Mr. Swan, because he's in charge of the project through the council's audit committee, and so I'm taking my direction.
Close.
Okay.
We can close 5
Was it helpful?
I'll say it's helpful.
Momentary deafness.
This question's for Alan. We talked about the RFP process, and the last time that it was in front of the board, you asked us to send in recommendations, which we did. Did you incorporate those suggestions into the RFP before it went out?
I believe I did. I certainly tried to, and the follow-up memo that I think we sent through Dr. Register to you detailed a couple of those big buckets. In particular, I understand how you feel like you're shooting a little bit in the dark. It's 2 years out before you actually realize where this expense is really going to be. That's why we started trying to give you some monetary figures along with the recommendations last year, and we can continue to develop that and do multi-year looks at that so that you have a better sense of the information. But in that memo, we talked about prioritizing the applications according to the priorities that you might lay out or that might be in an RFP, so that you could deal with those in terms of the degree to which they satisfy the needs you've articulated. And that'd be the first one that you'd deal with, and you'd deal with any others down to the point where the substantially negative fiscal impact was something that you believed meant it was time to draw the line. And that's where we would be talking about what the potential trade-offs would be, even though it's a challenge unless you're using a multi-year process to do that a couple years in advance. But the short answer to your question is I certainly tried, and I don't think I missed anything in terms of putting it in, but I may have. I know there was a whole child priority. I didn't see a consensus on that, so I didn't add that. But if there were a consensus, I'd be happy to add that.
I'd like to say, I'd like to speak to the deficit again, and I understand your concerns about that. And let me approach it a little different way. I think by the end of this year, and Chris won't say this, but I will, we will not have a $22 million hole to dig out of. I'm not sure that we'll make it all up in increased revenue. In fact, we probably won't, but it'll be somewhere between where we are now and making up part or all of that. The other part of our process is to look at ways that we can save for the 1,500 student reduction. We think $4 to $8 million. There are other variables that we can anticipate by the end of February. One big one that we discuss every year that we've had discussions with Mr. Riebling about are benefits costs. It's huge, and we're not seeing a negative picture there, but we're not going to talk about how we might be better off this year because we just can't anticipate that yet. So I think we have to look at where we think we might be, but also I want to go back to what I was saying before. I hear all of you saying we need to look at those highest return values and on what we can do and what do we need to do to serve the children in this district. And our responsibility is to let Metro government know and Mayor Dean know, or the mayor know, what those expectations are and what our needs are, and through the process. And we want to be responsible with those requests. And if you look back over the years, over the last few years, we've at least being judged by Metro Council and the mayor's office, we must have been pretty responsible because they've come very close to matching our requests. Give them credit for that. It's a priority. Education's a priority in this county. And you can have differences over one issue or another, whether it's charter schools or not charter schools. I think that's just one little piece of the bigger issue here. What does it take to adequately fund public education for 85,000 children in this county? And this Board of Education has the responsibility to say that. And I have the responsibility to try to communicate as effectively to you as I can what those needs are, and to take into account the federal budget and to take into account those other things that we're losing and what's not working. And I think that's the process that we go through for the next few months. The longer we go over the coming weeks and months, the fewer variables will be unknown. And as those unknowns become knowns, we can get much closer to matching what we need and what's available. And that is the partnership with Metro government and the mayor's office. And I think the process is not broken. It's not our responsibility to determine exactly how much fund balance we will use. I think we have to be responsible. I think we have to look at it. But remember, we are fiscally dependent on Metro government for our funding. And they've treated us very well in the past. And I think we should expect nothing less than that this year. We're in a good economy. We're growing. This county's moving ahead. I expect to get capital budget. I don't know exactly how much that's going to be, but for the last 3 years, it's been in the neighborhood of $100 million a year. That's for new school construction. We need new schools and we need renovations. And in the capital budget earlier, we were talking about the fact that we've deferred dealing with some big renovation projects. That's renovations of these high schools because they're big ticket items. I think we're getting to the place where we can address some of those and to have a plan going forward where we can address more of those. But we need to keep pushing on that, and we need to expect support from our community, from our Metro Council, from our mayor as we go forward to do what's important in this county, and that's to fund adequately the public education of our children, charter students, and other students in the public school system.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify, even for any viewing audience, that any decision on not opening a new school does not impact the the next year budget that you're talking about with the $22 million. It would go for the next year, correct? The 16, 17, any new schools, right? Okay, so it would have a note that's not even affecting the next year's budget. And then also just wanted to, with the under-enrollment concerns, the great safeguard built in with charters is the seat doesn't fill, it's not funded, and demand will end up dictating if you keep the school. So it's a good safeguard.
To piggyback on what Dr. Register said, I would challenge each of my colleagues to take the copy of the capital needs budget that we passed tonight and have a meeting with your particular Metro Council representatives and have a deep dive discussion with them on why these needs need to be funded, and just reach out to them on a personal basis, and I think you'll find that they'll be very responsive to that, and might be easier when we go before the council, because a lot of their questions will already have been answered. And so if you come across a question that you don't completely understand or know the answer to, please feel free to reach out to Mr. Pinkston and I, and we'll be glad to help you with that.
Just want to track back to something Mr. Henson said a few minutes ago. The comment was, I'm paraphrasing, is it's kind of a shot in the dark about how much revenue is going to be available. And again, we've got a $22 million hole that we have to figure out how to deal with through new revenue or corresponding cuts, just to get us to a 0% growth level. My recollection, and again, you don't have the numbers in front of me, I don't have the numbers, so these are like round numbers, but my recollection is in 2013-14, we got $15 or $17 million in new recurring revenue from the mayor and the council, and then there was fund balance, one-time money put on top of that, and then a similar amount the next year. So I think just based on our experience from the last 2 years, I think we have to assume that we're not going to get close to $22 million in new recurring revenue. If we do, that's great, problem solved, but again, that gets us to a 0% growth budget, and so kind of where's the new money on top of that? So if, in fact, we're getting into an environment where we're going to go in to the council and the mayor and say, hey, we want you to backfill this entire $22 million so that we're not exposed going forward. And oh, by the way, we've got 10 or 12 or 15 on top of that. And oh, by the way, 2/3 of that's going to be consumed by cash outlays for charter schools. And then we haven't done the introspective work that is going to be laid out for us in the performance audit and other things. I think if I was a council member on the receiving end of those kind of requests without the kind of retooling internally that I think is necessary, I'd be not happy. So I think looking at, as Ms. Kim said, looking at that performance audit as soon as it's available to see if there's any low-hanging fruit and pick, the 3 or 4 highest leverage things that we can tackle and show our colleagues in the council that we're doing our part to hold down the budget is going to be really critical.
I was just going to say that I know some council reps that also get tired of funding this much money every year and still having kids not be able to read. So it's, anyway, we can keep.
I think we have to be careful once we say that kids can't read. They may not be reading at grade level, but it's not that our kids can't read. Our kids are reading. They may be influenced by poverty and some other issues, and which is incumbent on us to provide services so that they will have tutoring and the necessary opportunities that their counterparts have had. But I think you need to be careful rather than saying they just can't read, because that's not accurate. Yeah, that's a different statement.
But it's way far behind.
Anything else?
I just had one question. Alan, I know that according to the state law, we have to accept the RFPs from those who send letters of intent. Is there a cap, or can we set a minimum of how many charters we will accept in any given year?
Maximum, you mean? The capital
Minimum.
top? A minimum?
Of how many we can accept?
Well, no, I mean, I think, the law reads that we have to evaluate each on its merits, and this board has to act up or down on each of those separately from one another.
So we couldn't say in the RFP, which has already gone out now, right?
No, the document has not gone out.
Okay.
Let me put a pin there. We'll come back to that. I want to make sure we finish that because I think there's some next steps on the whole charter process that we need to clear up. So I don't want to lose that. Mr. Pinkston, and then we'll come back to finish this one.
Dr. Brannon, there are no longer any caps in state charter law. Those were all wiped out in 2011 in, I would argue, a really ill-advised state law, but that's another conversation. However, there is statutory language in Tennessee Code Annotated 4913-108B, which encourages us, local boards of education, to consider fiscal impact in determining whether new charter schools may be quote-unquote contrary to the best interest of the pupil, school district, or community. So if we got into an environment where, like we were in the 2013-14 budget, where charter schools were consuming every dime of available new revenue, leaving nothing for our traditional schools, I think there's a strong argument that says we ought to consider invoking that statute. It's there for a reason, and there may not be reasonable people at the other end of the conversation, but that's, again, a different story. So yeah, we have the ability to have that conversation under state law.
So I'm going to finish that, but you go ahead.
As well.
Actually, to go one level up, I mean, just taking an aggregate, like the various challenges we faced over the last fiscal year in particular, and looking ahead in the context of this discussion, it does feel as though we need to be on some very tangible path where we are more carefully linking what's happening in the schools and the performance and the kinds of outcomes we're getting, kids reading on grade level, what we expect to see in every school, and with then real accountability that is linked to even budgeting. Because we're spinning around and around this, like it always devolves into the charters versus everyone else discussion. Even that statement of like it's devouring whatever the X amount of revenue. Well, we spend hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. I think that's actually a mischaracterization of like what's really happening. Revenue comes in, we tack it on top of the $700+ million operating budget already, and then it's like one giant pool that we decide to invest to get the results that we want. And I think the lack of clarity, like even just that, like how to think about the budget and what's intended to do, and it's like, I don't think it's these like incremental chunks. Like even like zeroing in on these incremental chunks causes this sort of like either or debate. And it's simply the question is, are we delivering the outcomes that we want for our kids? Are they in fact reading at grade level consistently, regardless of their ethnic, racial background, regardless of their socioeconomic status? Are they getting a great education? And where that's not happening, where we actually have the preponderance of kids not reading on grade level, which I think is what you're referring to, and we do have situations where that is the case, what are we going to do about that? And can we actually plan for that so it doesn't feel like a shock and a surprise, which all the roiling of East Nashville this last year proves, right? Like we would be well served holistically to think about this as one giant question. It's all linked. And if we can like put the roadmap in front of everybody, this is what we expect. Simply put, we expect this. We think all kids, it doesn't matter where you grow up, it doesn't matter the challenges, we are on a mission to educate you. And we're going to do it. And where it's not happening, we're going to take responsibility for it. We're going to link our budgeting and and we're going to create priorities that will enable that to happen. And then I think we'll be able to, when people know that roadmap and what we are holding to, like not just, like philosophically in our souls, like spiritually, everything, I think then we are more likely, it will not be without challenge, because everything's always complicated, but we are more likely to set ourselves all up for success, where we don't actually get into conversations that are either or this, which are still slightly missing the real point, or situations where like a whole neighborhood goes up
in rebellion because they actually are so surprised by what happened when nothing should have been a surprise. Which goes back to previous discussions about the APF, making sure that everyone is crystal clear about expectations and then consequences. In the effort, because number one, we believe people can rise to that when we actually set that forth. And if for whatever reason they can't, well, then we owe it to our kids to then figure out what to do next. And so I feel like that, it's anyway. We've danced around this at various points, but I'm just not seeing the full linkages, and I would love to get us on a path to have that, proposal. What does that look like, that long-term planning that is related both to the budget, but then also, fundamentally about the performance of the system?
So I'm going to take advantage of sitting in this seat. And, yeah, I'm going to wrap this up. And I'm going to tell you why. Because right now, there's no result. There's nothing going to get resolved tonight. But I will say this, and you guys have probably been able to figure out that there's been a myriad of conversations going on, not at this table, about budgeting and accountability. And that's what this really is all about. And it tends to devolve, as we've watched it do here at this table. I think, and it's almost, it's just human, when we can't explain it on this side, right? So I can go to a document we received a few weeks ago that listed for every school the amount of money that we spend. I think it was in one of the budget meetings you gave. I'd go page by page and see for every school what their annual budget was. And I can tell you, and I'm not going to name the schools, but I can think on the top of my head, two schools that were in the tens of millions that increased year over year over year, and their performance went nowhere. Actually, was negative. We'll throw out a hand, it is a district school, not a charter school. And so the amount of money that we give to a school is not the issue. The amount of dollars that we're giving to a school, regardless of the type, is not the issue. It's how we are using those funds within the school building and then ultimately within the district. And I think that's what this conversation fundamentally is about. Now, I will admit to a certain degree of ignorance about budgeting in an academic environment. I will say that's probably why, academicians get snubbed at a lot of times. We're soft, we're fluid, we don't really care. As long as it feels good and smells good and everybody's happy, then all is good. And there is just I think a different mindset among some of us here at this table, just from the different environments that we're in. That we've got to find a way, as Ms. Kim just put it, to connect the dots. That says, I have invested $10 million, and then I increased it to $20 million, and I increased it to $30 million in this school. And in none of those years were students reading at grade level. No year did the number of students who were reading at grade level increase over those years in this particular school. And so the question becomes, are we funding education, or are we keeping a balanced budget? And I know that maybe just culturally we do what we do because we've always done it that way. We say what we need, we go to the council, they either give it all to us, they give some of it to us, they give us some, we go here and get the rest, but everybody still gets paid, the electric bills are paid, books are purchased, students are in seats, and class starts. And at so for me, I'll give you my perspective on this, and I apologize in advance, is in my environment where I work, my revenue actually comes from doesn't come from corporate. We generate no money where I work. Yet we have the audacity to have people to explain what they're doing with the money that they actually made, that we give them permission to spend. It's so hilarious. But however, there is a process that says, I allowed you to budget $10 million. Your goals for the year were A, B, and C. And on a regular basis, we'd have discussions about how close you are to coming to those goals. Where should you be at the end of the first quarter, based on the amount of money you had, and then the second quarter and the third quarter. So I don't know if we do that in 9 weeks in the school district or not. But I don't, and maybe we'll get there with the school-based budgeting. Maybe those conversations will change. And I think that's what we're looking for here at this table. It's just a change in that conversation that says, are we investing funds in the right things? And I'll go so far as to say, and in the right people, to get the results that we believe define success within the district. And it's a fundamental, simple question that I don't think culturally we have processes within the district right now to follow and to align to, but we've got to get there. And so to bring up Ms. Kim's point, we've talked about pieces of this, and we always do, in just pieces. We've talked about a dashboard that probably one of the elements on that screen would be, and this is their budget, and this is how they're performing. We've talked about, the strategic plan. We've talked about all of these elements that are in place that should allow us to have some transparency into how our money and how our dollars are being utilized and what impact those dollars are having within the schools. And we've got to get there. Because, I think to just pull the thread a little bit on what Mr. Pinkston said, if I was in the council, that's almost what I feel, is that we just believe it's gonna get funded. So we just keep moving forward. We just keep going and we just keep going and we keep churning and we keep moving forward and not having healthy, and I would say responsible, proactive review of how we're spending that money and what we're getting for what we're spending. And we've got to find a way to get there, because then it truly becomes about, are our students, regardless of the label that's on the building, are our students achieving at the level we believe they are achieving as we have defined success as a district? The other piece I'll say is that makes me uncomfortable is this inability to define. I know it's complicated. I've seen the BEP formula. I know it's complicated. But what I will tell you is that one of the things I did in my day job several years ago is went to a very painful, and when I say painful, extremely painful exercise to determine exactly to the penny how much it costs to cut a single payroll check at every hospital. It wasn't the same amount for each hospital. It might cost me $2.32 to cut a check in Richmond, Virginia. It might cost me $1.37 to cut a check in Centennial Hospital here in Nashville, but I know exactly how much it costs, because then I charge that facility for payroll services. Took all the payroll people out of the hospitals, we consolidated into a shared service center, and I can now charge them as a corporation for processing payroll for them. So it can be done. I know it hurts. It took a long time to get there. But if we're going to experience some level, we're really going to get to school-based budgeting. I mean, the painful level of school-based budgeting, whether it's budgeting for charters or district schools, we have to be able to understand what that cost really is and what we're investing in. So I will say that to me, and what our next steps are, I think somewhere around February the 9th, we'll be able to have some information with regards to the audit results. I think Mr. Henson, there's a couple of things, and Dr. Coverstone, that we're going to put as some recurring discussions on our next few school board meetings, and that's going to be just where we are with budgeting and how we are incorporating. So I think part of the first presentation on the audit is what are those things we've incorporated in the budget, and as a board, where would we find them? I think coming back to us with what actually did go out from a charter school perspective, and then helping us then formulate the next steps that we need to do to hone in on those. I think the fiscal piece is first, though, and then we can narrow in on what we believe our fiscal bandwidth or capacity is for approving additional seats. But that brings within an assumption that we have some insight into our fiscal capacity beyond 2015-16, because that's a done deal, right? So those seats we know are coming. We've got additional seats that will come into place 2016-17 for this charter approval process. And we've already begun a discussion, I think, in the meeting we had at Martin, and I know that Ms. Spearing is going to further that discussion around success, but we've got to get to the point where we're looking on a regular basis at all those three pieces, at the dashboard, our school-based budgets, whether it's school-based budgeting we've gotten to or what has been allocated at the school level. And I'll go ahead and say it, a question I think I started asking 7 years ago when I joined the board is, how do we measure the impact of those initiatives that we do fund, whether they're funded through grants, whether they're funded through district dollars? How do we measure the impact of those initiatives? I know it's not always easy, and Dr. Majors reminds us of this, that we can't always say that this particular effort has moved the ball, but if we believe that there are things that are contributing, we should be able to put a bead on that and define that so that we can, to Ms. Hunter's point, fund what works and not fund what's there because it's there and we know it will still be there next year, so it has to be funded. We've got to start funding and budgeting for success. And I think that's ultimately the statement that defines this conversation we've been trying to have here tonight, that we just want to fund and budget for success and understand what that means and what that looks like. I'd like to biasly call this discussion to an end, and thank you all for your time.